It has been modified a number of times following various public consultations, and the most recent changes are quite interesting, and it seems a good idea to flick through some of them, which are thought-provoking as to the actual thrust and purpose of the content of this bill. We recognise entirely that the people putting it forward are certainly on the right side and want the best for the NHS, but the difficulty is some of the specific content. So there are 3 points in particular to run through, so I will just do that. So, looking at the first issue, everything in this bill is pitched to rolling things back to as at 2006. And I've just spoken to Peter Roderick, who is the public interest lawyer who has been kind enough to front this on the legal side with Alison Pollock, and asked him about the discussion process to take this back to 2006, that's mid-NHS privatisation, after the privatisation had already been running for a decade or so, rather than to pre-privatisation, which would be the ideal position, because under the trade and competition law regimes, so for TTIP and for the EU, the exemptions that are available for public services, the exemptions from the otherwise requirement for all public budgets to be up for open competition, i.e. effective privatisation, the only exemption is for an entirely nationalised public service. It has to be impossible to be making money out of the service. So it's interesting that the decision has been taken to only really roll things back as far as 2006. There may possibly be connections with EU competition law rules. There were some procurement rules from the EU that our government has introduced into our national legislation. And as usual with the EU changes that are put into our national legislation, there was never really any public debate about that, and certainly never any discussion of the extreme changes that actually makes to the frameworks which govern our lives in this country. So, as at 2006, we were already part way into the privatisation, and unfortunately, these exemptions are in the trade and competition law so as to look as though, these regimes are reasonable, but they are extremely tight and difficult to claim. And taking things back to halfway through the privatisation doesn't cut it. We need to actually take the market right back out of the NHS. The lobby which has been in favour of marketisation in the NHS is the privatisation lobby, because under trade law, something which has been part privatised is on the slate to be fully privatised. So as NHS reinstatement goes, this doesn't really cut it as an initial approach. And when I spoke to the lawyer just now as to the discussion around how to do this, where to cut in on this, he basically said that he couldn't remember, that it was ages ago, and then I pointed out that this changes in the last few weeks have been made. And he's just not telling me where these ideas are coming from, but they don't seem to make any sense in terms of the preamble and purposes of this bill. The content is not compatible with the statements, the narrative that's being made around this bill, and unfortunately that gives me a very uncomfortable feeling, because that is usually the case with the emanations from the privatisation machine nationally and globally. There's a lot of misrepresentation of things which nobody in their right mind would want in their laws. And it worries me that sort of coming adrift, a mismatch between the content and the narrative seems to be happening to this bill. It seems to have gone through a number of stages, and right at the moment it seems to have got the city's wish list pushed into it. So the first thing is this taking back only as far as 2006. The second thing is a concern around charging. Now, this second paragraph that's been highlighted here is actually something that was right back in Beven's Act. It's stuff about it being possible to make charges. And so, in itself, it's not necessarily problematic, but this is a very short bill. It is a piece of public relations. In fact, it is an educational tool, a lobbying tool, an activism tool, rather than an actual credible attempt to sort out the NHS. It's very, very bitty. It does not work as the legal machine that is required to actually reinstate the NHS. So it's not complete. It contains things which are really there to be highlighted. So it's very interesting to me that this wording has made it into that cut. It's not that it has to be in there because it has to be in there as part of a complete deal because of historical reasons. This is actually a PR tool, and it's very interesting that suddenly it has appeared in this that we need to we need to be protecting the principle of making charges within the NHS, because that again threatens the possibility of exemption as public service. The idea of a public service that can be protected from the trade and competition law incursions is that it's a mutual arrangement from which nobody is making commercial money. It has to be on a mutual basis. So the idea of putting charges in there is kind of an easy way in. It's another Achilles heel. It's another problem focus. And again, I'm not giving any explanation as to why that's highlighted in there. There's no explanation that makes any sense, and it's an odd thing to be putting in there in an instrument which sort of purports to be doing the opposite of that, to be protecting the principle that we have a mutual health service which we pay for when we are able, when we have money to pay taxes, we contribute, and then when we're ill, we accept services. There's nothing in there about why we should be shifting to fee-for-service arrangements like the US health services, healthcare industry, I should say. Those are not services. So it's interesting that this as an attempt to hold back that tide of change towards charging ever more for everything somehow has got a protection for that very same principle in there that is otherwise being pumped at us by, of course, the incoming healthcare industry commercial interests. So that's the second thing. There are many very good things about this, and I will not comment on those because they don't need to be altered. So I want to highlight the problems. Here I have highlighted NHS England. I just wanted to point out really that this doesn't tackle the fact that a representative of the US health insurance industry is currently heading NHS England. It seems to me that if one did want to reinstate the NHS as a public service, that might be something which we would want to address, and yet this just seems to accept the current infrastructure as though it's a good idea, staffed the way it is, run the way it is, with a set of incentives that are embedded in it, and those things are far from true. So it ought to be doing something about that, but it isn't. That was a suggested change, but it's a technical point, so I won't go through it. That is a side point. I don't deal with issues about staffing. There are unions, and the staff of our public services pay subscriptions to the unions to represent their interests. I have got many things to do without attempting to weigh in on that. I would just like to point out to people that as far as this is concerned, and indeed more generally, the unions are doing a very good job of compromising that representation of their members' interests. And if you expect your employment conditions to be protected when staff transferred are made between different entities, it would be a very good idea for you to take a personal interest and not just rely on your union leaders, because there is quite a high degree of accommodation among different political interests. People are staying in the game and not standing up for principles the way they should be. And it seems like the principles are now starting to disappear entirely. That selling out an accommodation process has reached such a degree that it is possible for people to effectively sign up to things which are very much against their interests. So the last problem, and in some ways the most glaring problem, is Section 21 labelled centralisation and reduction of PFI obligations. And this would take the PFI debts, which are currently tied to our hospitals and are being used to drag our hospitals down into the insolvency procedure and privatisation under the Health Act 2009, which again, this bill could do something about and does nothing about. So that's a glaring problem with the NHS legislation currently, that there is in existence a process of privatising hospitals, and that's not being removed by this. So those PFIs, it seems like a seductive kind of argument to say, oh, let's get them off the hospitals where they're causing such problems, let's centralise them all somehow, and then we could, maybe have more negotiating power. Unfortunately, while that's the way it's being sold, that's not actually the substance of it. Firstly, if you want to try and do something about contracts which were fraudulently entered into, it is not a very good idea to start severing the legal relations and passing those contracts to other parties. It makes it harder to do something about the problem. Secondly, once those debts are centralised into the Treasury, they will probably become part of sovereign debt, and we will all be condemned to pay for them out of our taxes forevermore. It will become impossible to do anything apart from what it is that the PFI lenders want, which is for us to pay them to go away. So really, this is exactly the dream of the PFI industry, to have this put forward as part of an NHS protection bill. This is the most extraordinary contract that this has gone in there. This idea has been pushed very, very forcefully upon NHS activists and upon left-wingers over the last few months. The city has really got its marketing act in gear, and people all over the place keep saying, oh yes, it would be a good idea to centralise them, wouldn't it? Oh, the people on the left are telling us this, and maybe this is really good advice. It isn't. It's advice coming straight out of the PFI lenders' mouths. What they don't want is for us to actually deal with the fact that this is, it looks to be a criminal scam. It's a premeditated scam to privatise our hospitals. You can look in the literature, for example, the Adam Smith Institute explain how PFIs work in the late 1980s, and they're part of the privatisation plan. So this whole idea that it would be nice to, put them in the Treasury and then our government will sort it all out against the PFI lenders, well, that rather falls down when you realise that it is because of those very same persons in our government that we have this problem in the first place, because they colluded with this setting up of our public services to be asset stripped through being loaded with PFI debts and then pushed into these innovative new privatisation procedures to privatise our public services. In short, it rather looks as though this most recent sudden revision of Alison Pollock's reinstatement bill has involved some trickery. It's not clear how that has happened, but there were problems with it before, and now it appears to have been hijacked entirely. And I think it would be a very good idea to find out the background to where these ideas have come into that non-specialist team that's heading and fronting this, where these bits of law have come in from, because they don't make any sense in terms of the avowed goals and of the people who are fronting it, and indeed of their observed behaviour. Both ladies, Professor Pollock and Ms Lucas, seem to be excellent people who really have their hearts in the right place, and it's very unfortunate to see that they're being turned around by legal tricks, and I think we need to get the bottom of this and sort this out. It's good that there's been so much publicity around the NHS reinstatement bill, but the content of the bill does not at the moment match that narrative, so perhaps it's up for us activists now to actually draw the legal side of it in line with the narrative side of it, and then we may have something.
Thank you so much.
That's like a monologue, please don't. You're going to do that.
Where else can we find more information about this anyway? Any sites that we can see? I remember your the article you wrote about the social laws of Africa. Is there an article that you've written about this already?
No, I haven't. All I've been doing really is sending this around and highlighting it, because honestly, the situation seems to be that the highlighted parts are really quite blatantly problematic. They clearly don't belong. You know, if we're going for a full renationalised public service NHS, why the stuff about charging? Why doesn't it take it back to pre-privatisation? And why are we looking at a PFI centralisation strategy that we know is what the PFI lenders themselves have been lobbying so hard for? So, you know, in some ways it's difficult to write around this because it requires critique and to go out on a limb in a certain way, so I think it's more helpful really to point to what's in their bill. But then it's not my interpretation, it's not my opinion, it's just pointing out this is in there, that seems to have a perverse effect. How did it get in there? Let's explore why that's the case and really explore how we can get it out so that it can do the job more effectively.
I think this is being presented by Caroline Lucas, and other MPs like Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell. Do you want them to contact you?
Yes, Caroline said that I should contact her, so I'll do that.
What's your name again? Did you say your
Lucy Reynolds.
Lucy Reynolds?
Okay.
And
Dr. Lucy Reynolds, thank you so much. Okay guys, this is Obi from Occupy News Network. I'll post it up on YouTube and on Facebook. Let's see if we can and then get it out there. Thanks. And yeah, if you can follow us, please, Occupy News Network on YouTube.
Sorry, I blasphemed in the middle. I had to get rid of that.
Huh?
I blasphemed in the middle, I didn't know what I was still recording it. Not still recording this.
do you represent St Helier Hospital? Are you from there?
I worked as part of the privatisation in the 1990s. I accidentally drifted into it and then got pulled out of it by some South Americans who understood what that meant. And then I became an aid worker. So I am used to getting things done in the medical field. In countries post-privatisation, that's mostly why medical aid workers are needed. But I'm used to getting things done by methods of activism which are not commonly followed in this country. And that is mainly because the activism in this country is all colonised by the interests it is fighting against. The model I work with does not involve getting into a group and then becoming captured by that. If you do things in an organisation-based way, you find it's very, very easy to hem you in. And most of the activist organisations either seem to be set up from the start by people who are interested in corralling and controlling. So they're astroturf organisations, or they're there to kind of gather together the activists and make sure that they're kept under control. And I think 999 probably understands how that process is working.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you have genuine, respectable organisations that get hijacked.
Half of us seem to be split down the middle.
Yes, and they do a divide and rule thing. People want to be nice, and they've got some really carefully market-tested lines like, "Oh, we must all be unified." But whenever you go along with this all being unified, it always transpires that the people pushing the "we must be unified" will not budge an inch from their position, and their position is always what the city wants them to do. So it's the way of pulling all activists away, because they always fall for this, "Oh, let's all be united, let's all be together, let's all be happy and hold hands and be friendly." But the only way you can actually preserve that unity if you're a genuine organisation that gets invaded is to basically start attacking your own interests, because there's a colonisation. People are awfully naive. They think that there is a democracy in which, everything works where we vote and then things happen according to our interests. Well, plainly in general experience that doesn't happen. And clearly there is an enormous amount of money at stake here. Previously the largest privatisation was the right to buy. Total value 40 billion over 25 years. So that's about 1-point-something billion per year. This privatisation of the NHS is 110 billion every year. That is due to double, because what the US pays for its healthcare is double and 2.5 times what we pay. So we can expect 110 billion a year to rise, so that's all up for grabs, and then there is also the land underneath. our hospitals, because that 40 million on the right to buy included all the land value. We have no idea how much the NHS real estate is worth, but it is enormous, and that is the main target. That is what was targeted in the 1980s. Foreign organisations came in and they mapped what our public services were and where there was something to be taken. And primarily, I mean, they do like to have, obviously, the whole budget running through their hands as well, if that's possible, but the main thing that they're interested in is the land under the hospitals. You know, at root, all of these things tend to kind of focus down to a land grab in the end. You know, land's the thing to have, they ain't making any more of it. So what we see as part of this privatisation plan, the only time it seems to have come out overtly out is when McKinsey's plans with government have been released for the QIP report, QIPP report, which was commissioned by the Labour government in 2009 and then suppressed by them and then used by the coalition as part of the privatisation. And that does explain that the intention is to privatise 1/3 of our hospitals, so those will be the ones with PFIs, because those are pre-built to be privatisation friendly, basically. They're pre-planned for that purpose. You can see it right from the blueprints. And then the other 2/3 of our hospitals, the plan is for redevelopment, sale for housing or retail or something like that. And the marketing narrative that's going to be used to sell that idea to us is called care in the community. You know, they really are insulting to our intelligence, because care in the community was exactly the same slogan used in the 1980s to sell off the land underneath the mental hospitals. At the time, we all were very well aware that no care in the community actually ever materialised, despite a lot of discussion about it. So then we had untreated people wandering around in the community who weren't able to take care of themselves and were a danger to themselves and potentially to other people as well. So that was not a humane solution. It was simply, we got fed an advertising line which we went for, oh yes, community services, that'll be much better. We neglected to note that there weren't any budgets or any plans for those, but it was actually a way to asset strip. And they are running exactly the same lines again, and people are falling for it all over the public sector. There are lots of meetings all over the country with activists and with health workers discussing about how it would be wonderful to have care in the community, and they are failing to notice that none of the things are happening that would actually happen if that system were going to come into place. There would be budgets, there would be overall plans, there would be policies. All there is a big public debate about how that will be good, and it's being used to make it possible to sell our hospitals. They won't be replaced with anything. There's no plans for the care in the community thing ever to be more than a slogan. So there we know the fate of our hospitals. 1/3 privatised, 2/3 redeveloped. Nothing is ever said about what's going to happen to the money that flows out from that. There's no plan to particularly pull it back into the public person, do anything with it. It's not a reshaping of the health services for our purpose, for us, the owners and patients of those health services. It is a reshaping of our health services into a healthcare industry. David Cameron actually got caught on film being a little more honest than one might have expected about this, because he suddenly announced, what I want from my Secretary of State for Health is to know how to drive the NHS to be a fantastic business. And I'm afraid there we have the long and short of it.
I was reading somewhere that the government, I don't know whether it's NHSbill.org or whether it was the government, saying something about charities being involved. Do you think that's another scam?
Well, what happens is, when they want to force a public budget open to the competition and trade law rules mean that if somebody is spending money on public services and they can get it into the competition net, they have a chance to bid for those if they want them, within a very complicated and demanding bidding process. So for every bid, you're talking about probably 2 inches thick of A4 papers that have to go in with various official bits and pieces. I did an evaluation of that set of processes within the NHS, looking actually specifically at this question of the role of charities within that contracting process. Because the intention was by a lot of the NHS is to go kind of get local community organisations involved, because that seemed to be a good way to go. So that's what they were actually wanting to do. And they said that when those kinds of organisations got the contracts, actually they tended to perform well. Not better than the public sector had, but about on parity. They have different strengths and weaknesses. But generally, the people who were supposed to be overseeing the service provision were very happy when those kinds of organisations got the contracts. But they said they find it really, really hard to get the contracts because of the bidding process. Because it's much easier to conform with a set of arcane and demanding bidding rules if you happen to have a bid team who does nothing else for a living, is paid, 40, 50,000 a year each, to be, for example, to know about contract law, to know about all the legal background to companies and this kind of thing, to follow all of those rules. The fact is that those little organisations, the charities and things, they put bids in, but aside from the national charities who really have geared up actually to compete with the commercial players, and in so doing have arguably changed their nature, small organisations, they can't get through the bidding process because they can't comply with all of the red tape which actually is there to produce exactly this situation. I went in on a bid in another country. We came in second. Preparing the bid cost £21,000 for external consultants alone, and it was a 5-organisation bid, and the commercial player within it had a dedicated bid team. So they also had to come up with £21,000 for dedicated consultancy just to put in that bid, and they didn't get the bid. So that's money wasted. Now actually, charities and the public sector, neither of those is allowed to sequester money in order to do that, to put in a load of bids which don't get anywhere. They have to use their normal staff working weekends and in the evenings. They can't bring in any extra skill set. Whereas a commercial player will have its bid team fully skilled up, with the best people, and they invest in it, and that's fine. They can write off that money against the contracts that they do with. So basically, this whole bidding process is presented as a level playing field and is anything but. So it disadvantages charities. So they're being basically used to front a very nasty, pernicious privatisation campaign by means of saying, oh no, it's fluffy charities, it's not huge conglomerates that are going to come and take over your public services. This is a means for fluffy charities to come in, except that they can't get through the bid gatekeeping process. What does happen, there was a study in The Guardian, Patrick Butler had a look at this. One charity went in with the commercial consortium on a bid to look after people with substance abuse problems. And they won the bid, and this was a year or so later, when they were really pretty upset about having won that bid, because they had been used as bid candy to make the bid more winnable, i.e., a part of a PR strategy. But they found that they were not being given the tasks that they were supposed to be given as part of this arrangement, which was supposed to subsidise their charitable work, instead of which they were being given work that cost them more to do than they were getting back from it, which means that the upshot of that is that those charities have been dragged into a position of illegality where they are using charitable donations to subsidise a commercial operation, which has then entered into a sort of partnership and then being completely taken for a ride. So I think that's the role of charities. There's then a further issue around this, which is that charities have been, for the last couple of decades, encouraged, seduced into this subcontracting role, where they take over public services that seem compatible with their main mission. And that looks lovely until the consequence of it roll through, which are diversion of resources away from doing the job into servicing a subcontracting arrangement. And that means that if people in charge move away from your charitable goals, you kind of have to go with it because you become locked in. It's also caused an awful lot of financial dependency, and that is a problem for any campaigning charities. For service provision charities, it might not be such a problem, but if you've got any kind of advocacy element, if you accept an income stream and become dependent on it that comes from the people you are critiquing, it becomes more and more difficult to actually critique those effectively. And actually that's a problem that's recognised in the city among the accountancy firms, and they therefore, all of them, the big firms, operate a rule which says that they will not take more than 15% of their money from any one source because it would be bound to compromise their independence. So what's happened is that the charity leaders who have not been sophisticated about that potential and understood how they've been hijacked in that way are being used as a front. So that is genuine charities. There's then a further element, which is that the next stage of the privatisation is very, very heavy on more misleading narrative about mutuals and social enterprises and lots of lovely, lovely, fluffy things like that. One activist has very astutely pulled this apart by adding in the little-known fact that whenever they are sorting out a mutual social enterprise, which are in fact, they're dressed up forms of privatisation, but they sound really nice. Whenever they can find a hospital team who is willing to take over providing the services outside the public sector, you know, as a kind of little management buyout thing, they are not allowed to keep control of the premises from which that service is delivered. At the point where it becomes a social enterprise or mutual, ownership of that land is transferred to a property company owned by the Secretary of State for Health, set up by the Health and Social Care Act 2012. And that is just a property company. It owns assets, but it can be sold. So the government is collecting together all of the NHS land that it is alienating from the NHS through this mechanism of, firstly, the social enterprises and mutuals, and then through the PFI deals. So it's collecting up as much land as it can, and then it's just going to sell it all for redevelopment. And then we're going to be, when we find out of it, we're going to be like, what? You did what? But where's the recourse? Pretty much everything that's being done to our public services right now is devoted to finishing off this privatisation. I think the commercial backers, the commercial sponsors of all of this may be getting quite impatient. It's been 30 years already. They have published the schedules recently, and we're at least a couple of years behind. Parliament has been incredibly compliant and stupid about putting in all of the legal dirty work that is necessary for the privatisation on the ground. It's still not going as well as it might. And occasionally activists are finally coming to the correct conclusion that they should quit wasting their time with all of this parliamentary democracy charade and actually go and attack the privatisation directly. Because the truth is, this is mostly foreign companies coming in to make a quick living, and if they can see that the public are going to hate them, that patients will hate them, that bystanders and neighbours will cause problems for them, honestly, they'll go and make their quick buck somewhere else. We really ought to get on to attacking the privatisation, if nothing else. But the public is not aware of one key strategy in this, that the privatisation is happening covertly under the NHS logo. Almost all of these privatised facilities have not got their private sector operators logo on, they've got the NHS logo on. And the idea is that they will produce bad services, but everyone will mistake what's happening and think, oh, the NHS has gone down. So not only do they make a quick killing at our expense, but they manage to blame their irresponsibility, negligence and deliberate penny pinching on the very services they're taking over. And you know, that was another comment from the commissioners when I spoke to them about who did the contracts well. I said earlier that the public services do them fairly well and the small charities and the community organisations do them well. And I left the other side of that comparison out. I asked also, how do the companies do these contracts? And the answer was, they're penny pinching all the time. They're only interested in how much money they can make out of it. They have absolutely no congruence of goals with any kind of public service perspective. They are just interested in how we can be made to be paid more for everything we need doing. This is not a cooperation, it's a choice.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, I did record that, but hopefully you have that on YouTube.
Yeah.